All right, we'll say good morning. Let's begin. Today's daf is Kuf Vav 106. We are picking up at the Mishnah on Kuf Hey Amud Beis 105b. So it's an interesting Gemara today. So a person goes ahead and remember we're speaking about different kinds of leasing agreements. So a person goes ahead and leases a field from his friend. So what happens? So grasshopper locusts come and consume the produce of the field. O nishtafa, or I will say, or the crop becomes wind blasted. In Makos Medinahi, so we'll say if this is what we call a Makos Medina. So Makos Medina will mean this is a regional affliction. In other words, this is not something unique to this one field, but this is happening regionally, and we'll define exactly what that means. Then Menake lo min chachuro. Then I both say the chocher, which we've translated as the tenant farmer, which is someone who pays a defined percentage, a defined amount. Ultimately, again, not just, let me say differently. Remember, again, an aris is someone who pays a percentage of whatever the crop is. A chocher is someone whose fee is locked in. He's locked in. So he's got to pay no matter what the field produces. So says the Mishnah, in the event that there's some type of regional affliction, so obviously the chocher's rate is prorated accordingly. V'im ein Makos Medina, but I will say for some reason the field that I leased, suffered a setback, but it's not a regional issue, it's just an issue in this field. Then ein menach lo min chachuro. Then ultimately I do not have a right as the tenant farmer to go ahead and renegotiate the amount. And Rashi HaKadosh points out, he says, why not ein menacha? Da'amar lo mazal chagarim. Because I will say the landowner can say to me, listen, it's your problem, it's your mazel. Meaning if it's a regional famine, if there's a regional issue, so again the landowner can't say to me, the sharecropper, to me the tenant farmer, the chocher, it's your problem. It's not my problem. This is a regional problem. As such, I'm permitted to readjust the agreement. At the end of the day, however, again, if this is something unique only to my field, then Lamaisa, again, he could claim it's my mazel that did this, and therefore I'm on the hook for the entire amount of money. Rabbi Yehuda says, well, it depends. In Kiblo Hemenu B'Mos, if Lamaisa, instead of going ahead and saying that I am chayiv to go ahead and pay a percentage of the crop, instead I go ahead and I negotiate a specific amount of money, then what? So it's actually interesting halacha. So if at the end of the day, let's say there are two ways that you can negotiate a chachirus, this type of rental or leasing agreement. I could say to the landowner, I'm going to pay you 2 kor of wheat. 2 kor of wheat. That's the classic case that we're talking about over here. And therefore the Mishnah teaches me that in the event that there is some type of regional event that affects the output of the field, I could prorate the amount I have to pay accordingly. There's another possibility. The other possibility is I agree to pay you $1,000 a year. $1,000 a year. So I'll say, in that case, Rabbi Yehuda is suggesting that when I agree to pay funds and not produce, then Lamaisa, even if there is some type of regional event, I still have to pay the funds. Rabbi Yehuda's logic is, because at the end of the day, I agree to pay money from the beginning. That reality has not changed, and therefore I'm on the hook for the same amount. Fine. Says the Gemara. We'll say, so of course the $1 million question is, Hechi Dami Makos Medina. So we'll say, here's what we know. We know that if I go ahead and I lease a field, and I agree to pay some type of percentage of my crop, if there is some type of regional event, regional locusts, regional wind blasting, something that happens that affects all of the fields, so I have the right to go ahead and therefore adjust my lease payment accordingly. Says the Gemara, so what is the definition of what we call a Makos Medina, a regional event? So Rabbi Yehuda, Kigon the Ishtifru b'debagyo. So Rabbi Yehuda says, if the majority of the fields in the valley, Bag is literally a valley, are affected. In other words, so we look at the area in which the field that I am leasing is situated. If the majority of the fields in that area have been adversely affected, that's called the Makos Medina. Ula Amar Kigon Shenishtatfu Arba Salas Me'abru Chosea. So according to Ula says, I don't need the majority of the fields in the valley to be affected, but rather what I do need is the 4 fields that border my field to be affected. So if my field and the 4 fields around my field are affected, that's called Makos Medina. Amar Ula, so Bava Ma'arav, so Ula said in Eretz Yisrael, they asked the following questions. They said the following. Nishtaf talam echad al pnei kula Mai. So we'll say, look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi, Nishta Talam Echad, V'lo Yoser Misados Shehin Sevivoseha, V'osa Talam Kol Sevivos Sada Zu. So we'll say, so what happens if it's my field got afflicted, and a strip of each of the bordering fields was affected as well? Is that called Makos Medina? Next question. Nishtayir Talam Echad Al Pnei Kula Mahu. We'll say, what happens if my field was affected, but the 4 strips of the 4 neighboring fields bordering my fields were okay, but the rest of the fields were not? So do those rows of healthy crops in each of the neighboring fields essentially create a break in the continuity between my fields and the neighboring fields? Next, Afsika Biramai. We'll say, what happens in the following situation? My field is wind blasted. The neighboring fields next to me are just barren, fallow fields. They were never planted. But the 4 fields bordering on the fallow fields have all been affected by the wind blast or by the locusts as well. Does that create a regional reality? Next, Aspasta, top of Kovav, Mai. We'll say, what happens if the neighboring fields are planted with aspasta, right? So aspasta is like fodder, animal field. So what if those fields aren't grain fields, but they were also affected? So does that constitute a regional event or not? So zera acher mai. What happens if my field and the neighboring fields are not planted with the same crop, but we're all impacted? Does that create a regional reality or not? Although we'll say, what happens if my field is a wheat field, the neighboring fields are barley fields? Does that create a regional event as well? Kala olam kulo bishidafon. So we'll say, so essentially what we're asking over here is, what's the halacha? Okay, I understand if it's my field and the 4 neighboring fields, all are planted with the same things and are all wind blasted or consumed by locusts. I understand that's a regional event. What happens if you have a change in any of those realities? What's the halacha? Next case, bishid kala olam kula bishidafon. We'll say, what happens if everybody's field was wiped out because of wind blast? Vishalo b'yarkon, but mine was wiped out because of what they call a yellowing of the grain. Inami kala olam kula b'yarkon v'shalo b'shidafon. Or everyone else's field was wiped out because of yellowing, and mine was wiped out because of wind blasting. What is the halacha about in all of these cases? To which the Gemara answers, Teku. Okay, so we don't know. Again, so we'll say, Eliyahu will have to answer this particular question for us. Amrle, we'll say, get ready for this halacha. This is amazing. Amrle zarachiti va'azhu v'zarasar. So watch this. I leased a parcel of land. We'll call it from Ruvain, and I leased it with the intention of planting wheat. Va'azhu v'zara. But v'zara, sorry. And what happens? Then I changed my mind, and I, the tenant farmer, the chocher, went ahead and planted barley. V'ishtadof ruba debaga, v'ishtadof nami hanach sa'ari delay. So what happens? The majority of the fields in the valley are wiped out by literally wind blasting, and my field is also, meaning I am the tenant farmer, I am the chocher, my crop is also wiped out. So we'll say, get ready for this. What's the halacha in such a case like this? Miyar minan, da'amrale ilu zarasachiti, havanami mishtatva. So can the tenant farmer say to the landowner, listen, you know what? It's not my fini. Remember also what happened in this case. In this case over here, I deviated from the lease agreement. I said I was going to plant wheat. And it turns out that I deviated and I planted barley. So can I say back to the owner, listen, what does it matter if I planted wheat or I planted barley? You see, all the fields in the valley were adversely affected. See, even had I planted wheat, the wheat would have been wiped out. So that's a claim that I, the tenant farmer, can make. We'll see, get ready for this. It's going to blow you away. Oh, Dilma, Matzi Amarle, or perhaps the landowner could have said to me, the tenant, the leaser, so right, Ilu Zara Sachiti, Havamekayim Biva Tigzar Omer Vayakam Lach. No, or perhaps the owner of the land could say to me, no, had you planted grain like we agreed to, then what would have happened? Vatigzar Omer, literally, that which is decreed, that which I decree, or I should say, I say that which is decreed, and it will be upheld. We'll say, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Vatigzar Omer, Masha tevakesh min hayotzer yaaseh, va'anilo bakashti, that which you ask from God is often granted. So we'll say, watch this. So this is amazing. So the landowner could say, no, you owe me the money. You know why? This whole year I've been davening for wheat to be successful. And you now tell me that you deviated and you went ahead and you planted barley. Had you planted the grain, had you planted the wheat as we agreed, my tefillos would have been more successful. Ultimately, again, the reason why there's such a setback is because at the end of the day, I was davening for the wrong thing the entire time. So to which we'll say, get ready for this. Mistabra, da'amarlei, izar asachiti have makayim biva tigzar omer vayakam lach, v'adrachecha nagor. We'll say, in this case, the halacha sides with the landowner. The halacha sides with the landowner. And the landowner has the right to say to the tenant, you owe me the full amount of the chachiros. Why? Because had you gone ahead and planted what we'd agreed on, my tefillos would have been more impactful. My tefillos could have potentially saved the crop, and therefore you owe me the entire amount. And Rabbi say, this is codified in the Shulchan Aruch, halacha lemaisa, that in the event that the tenant farmer goes ahead and changes from barley to wheat, or from wheat to barley, even though all of the other fields in the area were wind blasted, he still owes the landowner the full amount of the chachiros, the full amount of the lease, because the landowner could say to him, I was davening the whole time for chiti, you changed it to sa'ari, and therefore again you are chayiv to pay me the full amount. And says the Divrei Chaim, says the Sanzerav based on this Gemara, you know what the take-home message? The take-home message over here is not a din in Choshe Mishpat. The take-home message over here is the power of tefillah. Is what Chazal are teaching us about the power of tefillah. That here we're literally saying again that had the tenant farmer, planted the right thing, who knows what the tefillos of the landowner, of the owner of the land, could have accomplished. The power of tefillos. Sometimes we don't realize, again, the koach of our incredible tefillos. That sometimes at the end of the day we don't understand the impact that we have the ability to make with our davening that we do each and every day. We'll say such an incredible yisod. We often check a box. We often check in and we check out. And again, often for good reasons. We're often pulled in many different directions. But here I both say you have it again. Chazal are asking halacha lemaisa based on the koach hatefillah. An incredible Gemara. Nishtatfu kol sados of shal machkir. So I'll say, by the way, it also tells you how, again, you can say that Rebbeinu Shalom knows what's going on. And you understand also the power of davening for what it is that you want. You understand that even though the Rebbeinu Shalom, of course, could direct the tefillos wherever he wants to collect, wherever he wants to channel it, at the end of the day, my tefillos make the greatest level of impact when I have a defined purpose in my davening. That's also the message that's coming out of here. A lot more to say on this, but all right, we'll save it for a legal holiday. Nishtadfu kol sadosa shal machkir. Also, listen to this next case. Let's say again, all of the fields, the machkir is the landowner. Let's say the landowner owns multiple fields. All of them are wiped out by wind blasting. So v'shtadov namiyahu ba'hadayu, v'lo shtadif from the bagas. Well, so what happens? I'm leasing the land from Reuven. So it happens to be all of Reuven's lands are wiped out. They're all wiped out. And what happens? Including the one that I am leasing. But interestingly enough, the other fields in the area of my leased field were not wiped out by the wind blasting. So, Mike, what's the halacha in such a case like this? So on one hand, I can say, since the majority of the fields in the region were not wiped out, therefore, again, I cannot go ahead and adjust my leasing fee. The other possibility is, maybe the other possibility is, since all of the lands of Reuven were wiped out, I could say to Reuven, obviously this is your mazel. This is your mazel. So because it's your mazel, therefore again, I should be permitted to go ahead and adjust the leasing fee. Because look, all of your fields are wiped out. Mistabra da'amarlei, so to which Reuven could respond back to me. Reuven, the landowner, could respond back to me. So this is interesting about it. So Reuben could say, you know what, if it was because of my mazel that the fields were wiped out, a little bit would have been left for me. That sometimes again, when the Ribono Shel Olam is going ahead and exacting retribution from a person, he doesn't necessarily leave him totally destitute, he leaves him just a little bit. Just a little bit. So says Reuven, if it was my mazel, the fields in their entirety would not have been wiped out. Rather, again, a little bit would have been left over. So because ultimately, again, it's been totally been wiped out, therefore again, it's something different than my mazel, and therefore again, you owe me, and because the other fields in the area were not wiped out, therefore you owe me the full amount of the lease. Nishtadfu kol sados of shel chocher. Both listen to this. What happens if I, the tenant farmer, I, the chocher, also own a number of lands? And what happens? All of my fields are wiped out. Ve'ishtadov ruba debaga, ve'ishtadov nami ha bahadayu. And we'll say what happens. And the field that I'm leasing from Ruvain, as well as the majority of the fields in this general area, were also all wiped out. What's the halacha? Mi amrinan kevan ve'ishtadov ruba debaga menachile. So do we say that since the majority of the fields in the region are wiped out, so therefore I can readjust the rental fee due to Ruvain? O dilma kevan de'ishtadov kula adaite matzi amarle mishum lasach didachu da mishtadfu kol sadosech. Or could Ruvain say to me, listen, Silber, this is your mazel. This is your mazel. Meaning again, all of your other fields were wiped out as well. Therefore, this is because of your mazel that the field was wiped out. Therefore, you owe me the full amount. Ultimately, again, of the lease agreement, mistaber da amarle mishum lasach. Excuse me. Mistaber da amarle mishum lasa'achu. So we'll say, ultimately, again, it appears to be clear that the landowner could say to me, the tenant farmer, it's your mazel that caused this, and therefore, again, you have to pay me the full amount. So the Gemara says, Amai, hachanami nemalei imishum lasai didi. So we'll say, but why can't I respond back to Reuven? But if it was my mazel, then what? At least a little bit would have been left in accordance with the pasuk that we quoted before. The Amarlei, because ultimately, again, Reuven, the landowner, could say to me, because Reuven says, if the Rosh wanted to leave you a little bit, ultimately would have left you a little bit from what? From your own properties and not from the property of one that you leased. Therefore, by definition, this is your mazel that was going this, and therefore you have to pay the full amount. So we'll say, let's take a step back for just a moment. What are we talking about over here? We're talking about the halacha of someone sells ancestral lands. So if someone sells what we call a steachuza, ancestral lands. So the halacha is, we'll say, what happens with ancestral lands? Comes Yovel, land reverts back to its original owner. Not only that, but during the years of Yovel, I have the ability to go ahead and repurchase my land. But there is an interesting caveat. What's the caveat? You can't buy back or redeem what we'll call ancestral land within the first 2 years of the sale. So if I sell what I call my steachuza, my ancestral land, meaning it belongs to my family, part of my tribal land, I sell it, I can redeem it, but I can't redeem it for the first 2 years. Now, what the Bryce over here is discussing over here is what counts towards those first 2 years. So, for example, now look at the Bryce again. If during one of those first 2 years it was a year, ultimately again, of wind blasting or yellowing of the wheat, O Shavuos, or a Shemitah year, O Shahayu Shnanim Kishay Eliyahu, or there were years like Eliyahu. Also remember again, there were years in Eliyahu Hanavi's reign, during the reign of Achav, where there was no rain. No rain. And of course, no rain creates major regional famine. So what happens? So the Gemara says, in all of those cases, so these years won't count towards the 2-year minimum for steachuza. So the Gemara says, interestingly enough, katani shidafon v'irakon, now the Gemara seems to equate shidafan and yerokin, wind blasting and yellowing of the grain, with the years of Eliyahu. Mashne Eliyahu, delo havi tvua klal, just like the years of Eliyahu, there was no grain at all. Af hachenami delo havi tvua klal. Well, that seems to say that also shidafan and yerakon ultimately again are only problematic if what? If there's no grain at all. So the Gemara says, about the ikatvua, I will say if there is some grain somewhere, salkale, then ultimately the years will count. Velo ka'amrinan makas medinahi, and we will not say that ultimately again it is a makas medina, it is a regional famine. So we'll say what this sounds like is, even if there's not grain in the immediate vicinity, if there's grain somewhere, then you don't call that a makas medina. Amrav Nachar Bar Yitzchak, Shiny Hasam, no, this case is different, I'll tell you why. Damakra, The mispar shnei tevuos yimacher lecha. We'll say it's different because by stei achuza, the Torah explicitly says that when you sell the stei achuza, when calculating how to go ahead and redeem it, you calculate what we call the mispar shnei tevuos, the years in which the field could go ahead and yield grain. Which also tells you that when calculating the 2 years of I'll call it the non-buyback period, it has to be years where the field was capable of producing grain. But if for some reason the field was unable to produce grain, that does not count as one of the 2 years. Amar lei Rav Ashi l'Rav Kahana Elame'ata. If that's the case, so Shavuos ta'alelo min haminyan taha'ika tevua b'chutz la'aretz. So if that's the case of Osai, then why doesn't the Shemitah year count as one of the 2 years? Because even though in the Shemitah year you can't work your own field, but there is still grain to be produced, even in Chutz La'aretz. In other words, that's still called Shnei Tevuos. It's still called the year of grain. To which the Gemara answers, Amalei, Shavuos Afka Asa de Malkahi. Shemitah is different, because Shemitah, if you look at Rashi, Afka Asa de Malka, Hamelach Bitlo Milazara, the king has commanded that you can't seed the field, Vaharihi Kemo She'eno. And I will say, because the king is the one who says that on Shemitah you have to allow your field to lay fallow, it just doesn't count as one of the years. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, Amar le Marzucha Beid Rav Mari, Ravina Al Me'ata, Shvius Lo Sala Lo Mina Girua. So if that's the case again, then why does the Shemitah year both say count? See, when you redeem ancestral fields, so the way it works is the following. Everything is calculated based on a 50-year sale. So we'll say, by the way, it's like this in Eretz Yisrael today also. In most places in Eretz Yisrael, when you buy land today, interestingly enough, you don't actually purchase land. Instead, what you have is you have a long-term lease. You could have a 100-year lease. But it's very interesting. So we'll say, so it's always, by the way, it's always fascinating to see that certain things in the contemporary Medina, knowingly or unknowingly, are carryovers from biblical Eretz Yisrael. It's fascinating to see. In any event, so we'll say, so when you sold land in biblical Eretz Yisrael, pretty much you sold land for 50 years. Because remember, if I was selling my ancestral land, I'm getting that back in the Yovel. Which means that if you wanted to redeem land sometime during the Yovel cycle, how do you decide on the buyback amount? How do you decide on that? So first, the way you decide on buyback amount is we calculate the number of crops, the number of crop seasons between now and Yovel. That represents the value of the field. That's the amount, the future amount of produce that this field is going to produce. Now, interestingly enough, when calculating that out, guess what? Shemitah year is included in that valuation. Because remember, again, in the 50-year cycle, you have 7 Shmitos in there. Those years are counted as part of the value of the crop cycle of the land. So if that's the case, if we're saying the Shemitah year doesn't count for one of the 2 years of the non-buyback period of ancestral land, why does it count as part of the general buyback period of ancestral land? To which the Gemara says, why do we learn? No, saying selo punyon l'shana. So we'll say, because again, without getting, Rashi goes through the whole calculation, I'm not going to get into it now, but you give a sela and a punyon for every year, which indicates to us that Lamaisa, again, the Shemitah year is calculated as part of the buyback period. Amarle shiny hasam, no, because it will say that even during the Shemitah year, even though you can't work the land, so the Shemitah year ultimately is not going to year of produce, but you can use the land. How can you use the land during the Shemitah year, Abosai? Because again, it can be used to spread out fruit over the land. So again, I can't use it to plant, but I can use it for other crop purposes. Amar Shmuel, Lo Shavuos, so going back to the Mishnah. Lo Shanu Ela Shazar V'Tzem Chava Achlach Agav. So we'll say, so when do we say that if I leased a field, and then there was a regional issue, like locusts, wind blasting, or famine, whatever it was, that I could go ahead and adjust my lease amount? That's only when I planted, the crop grew, and it was consumed by locusts. Avalo zara klal lo. But we'll say, if I never planted at all, and then what? Let's say, listen to this case. Let's say I never planted at all, but all the other fields in the region were affected by some type of regional event. I can't readjust the lease payment based on the fact that all the other fields were planted. In other words, I can't say, well, look, had I planted, you see what would have happened, so therefore I should be permitted to adjust the payment. It doesn't work that way. If you didn't plant, you still have to pay the full amount. So the Amarle ilu zarasav mekayim bi lo yevoshu be'isra or b'meira avon yispu. Because it will say, if I don't plant, the owner of the land could have said to me, listen, for all you know, had you planted, there would have been a special bracha on my crop, and therefore what? It would not have been affected like everyone else, and I would have had produce. Massive Rav Sheshes. So Rav Sheshes says the following. Literally, the passage that they're quoting is from Tehillim. Lo yevoshu be'Israel, do not despair in a time of evil. Ubemeira avon yisbu, because Chashon Baruch Hu could allow for sustenance even during a time of famine. So what's essentially what the owner is saying is, just because all of the other fields were adversely affected, doesn't mean that it's impossible that had you planted the field, my crop would have been protected. Says the Gemara, what is the kasha? Meser Sheshes, roeh shaya roeh. So if there was a shepherd who was shepherding, v'hiniach edru baliyah. So we'll say what happens. Remember, we actually had this case before. He left his flock for a little bit in the middle of the day, came into the city, which Rabbi say is normal. Is normal. Apparently, again, shepherds used to leave the flocks for some amount of time. Uba ze'eh v'tarach, and a wolf came along, killed some of the sheep. Uba rividaras, or a lion came along and killed some of the sheep. Ein omrim ilo haya sham haya matzil. We don't say, had the shepherd been there, he would have we don't automatically assume that if the shepherd was there, he would have automatically been able to save the flock. Ela umdin also im yachol lahatzil chayev v'im lav patur. They both say, we look at the shepherd, we look at the nature of the predatory animal, and we assess. There are times where if the shepherd was there, he could have scared off the animal. And there are times where if the shepherd was there, he would have been scared off, right? He would have done nothing. So we assess it. If the shepherd could have prevented the loss, then he's going to be chayiv. If he couldn't have prevented the loss, he's going to be pater. Va'amai. But I don't understand. Why don't we say, Neimale, I havis hasam, have mekayim bi, games ha'ari, games hadov, hika avdecha. We'll say, so remember, why don't we say something we said before? Just like we said before, that if the tenant farmer doesn't even plant the field, even though the entire region is wind blasted, so the tenant farmer is still going to be chayiv to pay the lease amount. Why? Because the owner of the field could say, listen, had you planted, an ace would have been performed for me. So I will say, so why can't we say over here, why can't the owner of the flock say to the shepherd, had you been there, right? Perhaps a nace would have been performed for you as well. Mishum da amar lei, I havis chazis l'sachushe l'chanisa, havis rachish l'nisu. This is a good line. Because the shepherd could have said, listen, if you're so pious that you deserve a miracle, the miracle should have happened for you even if I'm not there. Right? Don't, right? If you're such a tzaddik, the Yibon Shalom could provide, harbe shluchim yesh l'makom, right? The Yibon Shalom has many different agents. So if you're such a tzaddik that you deserve miracles, you don't need me. I'm just a simple shepherd to perform the miracles. After all, again, we saw this before, that Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa had beautiful miracles performed for him. The Masyon easy Dui Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, in his flock, his sheep, his rams, used to bring bears on their horns. As I will say, that when bears would attack the flock, the sheep or the goats themselves would defend the flock. So the shepherd could say back to the owner, listen, don't go ahead and make your miraculous activity dependent on me. If you're such a tzaddik, then ultimately, again, the miracle should have happened on their own. So why can't the owner respond back to the shepherd? So it's true. Maybe I don't merit great miracles. Lenisa zuta chazina on the base. Maybe I should merit against small miracles. Kasha. Indeed, I will say that is a kasha. So I'll say, bottom line, interesting enough, what you see over here is the following. And there's a very important yesod over here as well. That essentially, not trying, but if a person doesn't engage in effort, that always saddles you with liability. That's the bottom line of the halacha. So if you don't plant the field at all, even if the other fields in the region are windswept, you are still going to be on the hook for the entire lease amount. Why can't you claim that at the end of the day, had I planted, you see what's happening to all the neighboring fields, what have happened to me. Salamai, you see that again, there's an obligation to put in effort. And if you don't put in effort, then one thing is sure, which is, you have complete liability. If you put in the effort, absolutely things happen, and if things happen, the halacha frees you from responsibility under certain circumstances, but non-effort always results in complete responsibility. Tani Chada. So let's listen to this. So let's say we have one brayz that says the following. So this is actually very interesting. So in this same topic, take a look for a moment at the first Rashi. So let's say if the tenant farmer plants the field the first time, the second time. Zara va'achla chagav on mishtava chozer v'zara shenis. Im eino zara elamanach elo afilu himakas medina. So also listen to this. So the halacha with the sharecropper is that even in these cases where there is some type of regional event, the sharecropper has to the tenant farmer has to try multiple times to plant. So if he tries the first time and it doesn't work, second time and it doesn't work, third time and it doesn't work, then he's permitted to go ahead and somehow readjust, or adjust, I should say, the lease amount that's due. How V'tanya Idach, was another brisa that says Shlishes Zora, Revius Eino Zora. So we'll say the second brisa says he has to plant it 1, 2, 3 times. Fourth time he doesn't have to try anymore. So also you see the machlokes. First brisa says he has to try 2 times, and really on the third time he doesn't have to try again, but he could readjust the lease amount. Second brisa says he has to try 3 times, and the fourth time he assumes it's not going to work. So which solo kasha? Both say it's not a contradiction, 2 different opinions. Hakrebi, the Amar, betray zimni havi chazaka. The Amar betlas zimni havi chazaka. So we'll say, so bottom line, it's a machlokes in chazaka. There's a fundamental dispute that we see throughout Shas about how many times does it take to establish chazaka. Rebbe says it's 2 times. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says it's 3 times. Nafkamini will be this case. At what point in time do we establish a chazaka that the crop is not going to take? So Rebbe says 2 times. That's the first brisa. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says 3 times. That's the second brisa. Fine. Says the Gemara. Amrei Shlakish lo shanu ela shazara v'tzamcha v'achla chagav. So we'll say, when do we say that under certain circumstances, if there's a regional event, so the tenant farmer could go ahead and readjust the lease amount? That's only if he planted the crop tzamcha, the crop blossomed, va'achla chagav, and then the grasshoppers ate it. Aval zora v'lo tzamcha. I will say, if let's say again the tenant, the chocher, the tenant farmer planted, but the crop never sprouted, matzi amar le balakarka kol yemei zara lava azil. So we'll say the owner could say, listen, if it didn't sprout, if it didn't blossom, it's a better word, not sprouting or blossom. What's the root? Okay, fine. If it didn't take root, then what? Then plant again. In other words, I will say, the planting season is not just 1 day. So the owner of the land could say, okay, if you fail, try again. So it didn't take root, so just try it again. Va'ad ema. So we'll say, that's a very interesting halacha. So up until what point in time is the tenant farmer obligated to keep trying to plant? So watch this. Amra papa ad asu aris midabra, until the sharecroppers come home from the field. V'kaima kima arashayu. And kima is on their head. So we'll say, without going through the entire shackle, you can see it's a pretty long Rashi over here. So I'm going to give you the bottom line. Until the month of Adar. That's the bottom line. Right? So the Gemara says that this is a descriptive Adar. Right? So until Adar apparently is the end of the Rabbi. Now, by the way, Adar is actually late. So you understand Adar is late. Why? Because remember again, Tu B'Shvat is normally we assume the cutoff on the reading pretty much like the end of the winter, not the end of the seasonal winter, but the end of planting winter. But yet here the Tana says until Adar, which means if I'm a sharecropper and my plants, whatever my crops are not taking root, I have the obligation to try up until Adar. So the Gemara says, Mesi, really that late until Adar? Rabbi Shimon Omer, V'chin Hayir Rabbi Shimon Menashe Omer, Kidvarav. Well, so listen to this. So you have Rav Shimon Menashe saying, here is the agricultural setup. Chatzi Tishrei, Mar Cheshvan, V'chatzi Kislev Zera. From the middle of Tishrei, the month of Cheshvan, and as you will say, I just want to point out, by the way, you see, we often assume that Mar Cheshvan ultimately again is that Mar Cheshvan is because again we like the Vart that there are no Yomim Tovim. So we'll say it's quite possible, according to many opinions, that the name of the month is actually Mar Cheshvan, right? Or Marach Shivan, whatever the name is. That's why again we refer to it as Mar Cheshvan, not just because we're so sad there are no Yomim Tovim. That's why, for example, in a Ksuva, according to many opinions, if you just write Cheshvan and you don't write Mar Cheshvan, it could actually be problematic. So again, this point just a side piece of information. The Chatzi Kislev, you can do absolutely nothing with that piece of information, right, except write Ksubas. In any event, it says the Gemara, the Chatzi Kislev, so the half of Tishrei, the month of Mar Cheshvan, and half of Kislev, Zera. That's the planting season. That's the planting season. Chatzi Kislev, Teves, the Chatzi Shvat, half of the month of Kislev, the full month of Teves, and half of Shvat, which was it takes you up to where? Half of Shvat takes you to Tu B'Shvat, Sechorev. That's called winter. Chatzi Shvat, Adar v'Chatzi Nisan, half of the month of Shvat, the month of Adar and half of Nisan, Kur. That's called the cold season, or winter. Chatzi Nisan, Iyar v'Chatzi Sivan Ktsir, half of the month of Nisan, the month of Iyar, half of the month of Sivan, is considered the harvest season. Chatzi Sivan, Tammuz v'Chatzi Av, Kayitz, so let's say half of the month of Sivan, the month of Tammuz, and half of the month of Av, until Tu B'Av. That's called summer. Chatzi Av ve'elu v'Chatzi Tishrei Chom. So we'll say, so apparently in Eretz Yisrael, there's summer and there's Chom. Right? There's hot and there's really hot. So apparently again, from half of the month of Av, Elul and Tishrei is Chom, exceptional heat. Rabbi Huda, so that's how Shem Manasseh reckons the seasons, right? And obviously this has ramifications because it tells you when you plant. Rabbi Huda says mitishrei. So we'll say Rabbi Huda begins the counting not from the middle of Tishrei, but rather he backs everything up by 2 weeks to the beginning of Tishrei. Rabbi Shimon Mona Mar Cheshvan. Rabbi Shimon goes ahead and he counts it from Mar Cheshvan. Saman Mekel B'Kula. So we'll say who is the one who is quote unquote most lenient. Now when we say lenient, it means who is the one who allows for the longest planting season? Rabbi Shimon. We'll say it's Rabbi Shimon. The Kule Hailo Kamar. Yet even Rabbi Shimon doesn't have the planting season extending to Adar. So let's say we have a kasha because we just said before that Lamaisa, again, if you are the sharecropper, so you have an obligation to keep trying to plant the field until Adar. Yet, the longest duration for planting is Rabbi Shimon, and even Rabbi Shimon doesn't go until Adar. To which the Gemara says, Lo Kashya, Had Kabla Minei Mecharfi, Had Kamei Batr. We'll say everything depends on what type of crops. See, in an agricultural society, in order to take full advantage of the planting seasons, there are two types of crops that you would plant. You would plant what was called Charfi, which means early crops, and you would plant what's called Afli, which are late crops. So for early crops, Eina Chinami, so the planting season ends before Adar, but for late crops, there was some planting that ultimately would go into Adar as well. Therefore, when we tell the sharecropper to go ahead and keep planting, we tell him again, it would have to be with certain types of later blossoming crops. Okay? Rabbi Huda Omer, and Kibul Amenemal. So we'll say, remember again, so Rabbi Huda said, going back to the Mishnah, Rabbi Huda said that halacha l'maisa, if the chachirus was framed with a monetary amount, as opposed to a crop amount. I was supposed to say, I don't say, remember, the typical case of chachiras that we're dealing with is, I lease the land to Reuven, I say, Reuven, I'm going to pay you 3 quarts of wheat. That's it, done. 3 quarts of wheat. It depends, whatever the field produces, I'm going to pay you 3 quarts of wheat. So Rabbi Huda says, if instead of saying, so that's when, if there's a regional event, I could readjust the lease amount. Because again, it's dependent on crop output. If on the other hand, I say to Reuven, I'm paying you $1,000. So Rabbi Huda says, if we negotiate a dollar amount, then what? Even if there is a regional event, I cannot change the terms of the lease. I have to pay in the same amount. So says the Gemara, Hahu Gabra de Kabil Aralam Izrei Buhutumi Betumi Agad Dinar Malka Sab. So we'll say there was a man. I went ahead and I leased land from Reuven, and I leased it from the land was on the banks of the Malka Sava River. And I went ahead and I leased it from him to plant Tumi. Tumi is garlic. What happens? Bezuzi. And I will say I went ahead and I agreed on a certain amount of zuz. Right? So meaning this is a case where the lease is framed not in a payment of produce, but rather in a monetary payment. Watch this. Istaker Malka Saba. So the Malka Saba River was stopped up. And therefore I'm going to say because the river was stopped up, what happens? I could not properly irrigate my fields, and therefore there was no crop. So I come before, right? So the Chocher, the tenant farmer came before Rava. Amar leh. First wide line about say Kofav Amadays. Nahar Malka Saba lo Abed Miskar Makas Medinahi. It is uncommon for the Malka Saba river to become stopped up, and therefore again about say this is what we would call a Makas Medina. Zil Nechi leh. So Rava said to the tenant farmer, you could readjust your lease amount. Because this is a Makas Medina, is a regional event, you can readjust your lease amount. So the rabbis went ahead and said to Rabbi Huda. Rabbi Huda explicitly said in the Mishnah that what? That if you negotiated a dollar value for the lease, then even if there's a regional event, you can't change the lease amount. But this is create Amr Lahu, less the Chash Rabbi Huda. who holds like Rabbi Yehuda, Rava said, right? So meaning, in other words, that just because Rabbi Yehuda is mentioned in the Mishnah doesn't automatically mean that we pass. So Rava says we do not subscribe to this approach, and therefore, again, even if there was a dollar figure attached to the lease amount, if there was a regional event, so ultimately, again, the tenant farmer could go ahead and renegotiate the lease amount with the field owner. Says the Mishnah, "Hamekabel sada mechavero ba'asara korchit al mashana v'loksa." So we'll listen to this. So again, still in the realm of chachirus. So I went ahead and leased a field from Reuben, and the way we work it is, I agreed to go ahead and pay him 10 kor of wheat per year. That's the amount, 10 kor of wheat per year. V'loksa. I will say what happens. So the field produces, but the wheat is of inferior quality. The wheat is of inferior quality. Look at Rashi. V'laksa, it's the fifth wide line in Rashi. V'laksa, sheyuchitin shedufos, v'gab gechushos, v'zu b'chachirus v'tchulishno. So we'll say, listen to this. So it produces grain, but the grain is of an inferior quality. No sin lo misocha. So we'll say, so the halacha is, I could still pay him from the inferior quality wheat. In other words, that we don't, so as long as the field produces enough wheat to pay him the amount, I can pay him from the inferior wheat, and I don't have to go purchase better wheat from somewhere else. Hayu chita yafos. But listen to this. Let's say, however, I go ahead and the field produces very good wheat. So what happens? Lo yomar lo harini lokech min ashuk. So I say to this, listen, I never promised him high grade wheat. I just promised him regular wheat. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go to the shuk. It's more worth my while to what? To buy for him average wheat, pay him with the average wheat, and keep this wheat for myself. That you can't do. Rather, again, Abba says, so bottom line, this works both ways. The tenant farmer always pays the owner from the wheat of the field. And that is true whether the wheat is inferior or whether the wheat is superior. Says the Gemara, Ho gabra de kabel arla aspasta bekuri disari. So I leased the field from Ruvain. Now watch this. I leased the field with the intention to go ahead, not the intention, but with the agreement to go ahead and plant aspasta. Remember again, aspasta is fodder, a very inferior type of crop that had only one use, which was animal feed. So I went ahead. So the way this lease agreement worked was the following: I am leasing the field to plant aspasta, and the lease amount, the payment is a kur of barley. So I'm paying him in barley. So obviously, I'm paying him in barley. That's the. So again, obviously, I'm not planting that barley. I'm going to purchase that barley, but that is the rental amount. I'm going to lease the field for a kur of barley. Avda aspasta. So what happens? My field. So I planted the aspasta. Shalamai. So I have a chashra v'zarasar. Then I decide, you know what? I had a good aspasta year. Now I'm going to plant barley. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a core of that barley and use it to pay off my lease amount. So we'll say, so remember, this is not in alignment with the agreement. The agreement was the field was going to be used for aspasta. I did year one of aspasta, then I said, you know what, year two I'm going to do barley, and I'm going to pay off the lease amount from the barley. So what happens? V'laku hanusari. The barley crop did not work out, and the barley crop was a bomb. Did not work out. Didn't take root. Shachar of chaviva misura depras lekamei dravina ki hagav demai. So what is the halacha in this situation? What is the halacha in this situation? Ki hagav demai ki laksa no sein lo misocha dami. So do we say that at the end of the day, look, the field was adversely affected, and the halacha is over here that just like the Mishnah said, listen, I pay you from what I have. Unfortunately, again, the field did not sprout proper barley, so I'm sorry. Lo. So I'm sorry. Kilaksa no silam socho dami. Lo, or not. Amar le, mi dami. How can you compare the two cases? Hasm, so we'll say in the case of the Mishnah, law of the Arish Lichusa Demara. So we'll say in the case of the Mishnah, so at the end of the day, literally, the field didn't follow instructions. We'll say, what does that mean? That in the Mishnah's case, again, I am doing what I'm supposed to be doing. I leased the field to go ahead and plant wheat, and whatever it is, the field didn't comply. So that's the Mishnah says, listen, I did my hishtadlus, the field didn't comply, I pay the owner of the field from what the field produces. Hacha, of the Arish Lichusa Demara. We'll say in this case over here, the field is doing exactly what it's supposed to. Meaning, in other words, I leased the field for what? For aspasta. The field produced aspasta. Then what? Then I deviated. What did I do, Rabbi Osai? I planted barley. That wasn't what the field was supposed to be used for. If that's the case, because I deviated, nothing happened with the land, the problem was with me. I deviated from the agreement. Therefore, what? Therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, I will be on the hook for the full amount of the barley. Ho gavra the kabel pardes mechavre ba'asar dani chamra. So again, I leased a field from my friend, literally an orchard from my friend. We'll call it a vineyard actually, a vineyard for my friend for 10 barrels of wine. Right, that's the value of the lease. Takif ahu chamra. So we'll say what happens. So the grapes are fine. We produce the wine, and what happens? The wine goes sour in the barrels. So what's the halacha? Savrav kana lemei mahaydu mas nisin laksa nosin lo misocha. So Rav Kana wanted to say, this is the Mishnah. What does the Mishnah say to both say? That again, if something happened to the barley, if the barley produced was an inferior barley, the person who's leasing, still has the ability to pay the balabas from that barley. And therefore, same thing over here. Nebuch, I'm sorry what happened to the wine, but this was the wine I set aside for you. It went sour, it's your loss. To which the Gemara says, Amalei Rav Ashi, no. Midami, how can you compare the cases? Hasam lo avda arash lichusa. Siyabosai, in the case of the Mishnah, so it was the land that did not comply, right? It was the land that did not comply. In other words, that at the end of the day, I did my best. The land didn't comply. It produced inferior grain. That's when I have the right to say to the balabas, no, here's your payment. However, again, hacha of the arish tichusa. Both say in this case over here, the land did exactly what it was supposed to do. It produced the grapes. Something subsequent happened again with the barrel, or with the wine. So because something happened, ultimately, again, Rashi says, of the arish lichusa, ha'adnovim lo loku. There was nothing wrong with the grapes. Elam mishenasi yain b'chaviyusa b'beisa laka. He'll say something happened with the barrels that were being stored in my home. Brahma abasa, chamra kafsa de garva shava. So we'll say, so because something happened with the barrels, I, the lesser, will be chayiv for that. Umod de Ravashi, be'invei de kadum, or besada shlak sabam rab. Ravashi will agree that we'll say in a case where the grapes themselves, kadum Rashi says, were wormy. If the grapes became wormy, there was something with them, then einachinami, I'd be able to pay from inferior produce. Or again, in the fields where the sheaves themselves were stricken, those are the cases where I'd be able to go ahead and pay a discounted amount. So I'll say, so stop over here. The bottom line, again, what's coming out is the following. The way the Mishnah Paskins is like this. If I am leasing property, I'm leasing a field, and I have a defined purpose for that lease. I'm leasing the field to go ahead and plant wheat. And then I'm going to pay you being the owner of the field, 2 core of wheat, and something happens, and then the wheat crop goes bad. I have an inferior crop. The halacha is that what? I am permitted to pay the owner of the field from that crop. I'm permitted to do that. So because why? Because I did my part. I could pay him therefore again from whatever I have. In the event, however, that I deviated, right? I leased the land in order to plant wheat, and then I planted barley. Then if I deviated, then again I will say I cannot claim a discounted amount, because since I deviated again, the onus is upon me, and I'll have to pay him the full value of the lease. So stop over here. Pick up your message tomorrow.